The schoolhouse stood alone on the edge of the Indiana fields, a single square of whitewashed timber rising against the flat horizon. It had been built with pride, the kind of place where farmers gathered on its opening day to believe in something better for their children. The windows gleamed once, panes polished until they threw back the sun. But with the years, the brightness dimmed, and what remained was a building that seemed to watch the fields rather than welcome them. It was never destroyed, never burned, never abandoned in the usual sense. It simply endured, waiting as though its wood absorbed every whisper that passed through its walls. Parents would walk their children up the narrow steps, holding their hands a little tighter as they did. They never spoke openly of the unease, but in their faces there was always a flicker of fear. Something about the way the bell above the door never seemed to rust, no matter how harsh the winters. Something about how the floorboards creaked even when no one walked them. The school had its reputation, and it was not the kind that belonged in public stories. Instead, it lingered as rumor, carried in lowered voices at the market or at church gatherings where no one wanted to admit what they already knew. The stories always began the same way. A teacher would arrive, young, bright-eyed, eager to make a difference in a small farming town. They would bring with them books from the East, or slates polished and ready, or simple crafts to brighten the lessons. And for a time, everything would seem normal. Children would learn their letters, parents would nod in approval, and the schoolhouse would echo with the sound of chalk striking the board. But as the seasons shifted, something would happen. The teacher would falter, their handwriting would change, sharp and uneven, their voices would thin out, they would begin to forget names. Sometimes they looked out the window too long, as if listening for something in the wind. And then, one day in mid-term, they would vanish. The chair behind the desk would still be warm, the book left open to the last page they read aloud. But no one would ever see them again. Not on the road home, not in town, not in the woods. Gone as though the earth itself had claimed them. The townsfolk spoke about it quietly at first. Some claimed the teachers left for city work. Others muttered of fevers or secret sins chased them away. But none of those explanations held because no one ever heard from them again. No letters, no sightings, not even rumors carried by strangers passing through. In time, the silence became heavier than the questions. The children who studied inside the schoolhouse rarely spoke of what they saw. Yet traces leaked out over the years. They said the chalk sometimes moved by itself across the board, spelling words no one had taught them. They said the walls groaned at night as if someone were pacing inside when the building was locked. One child whispered that when their teacher disappeared, the air in the room carried a taste of iron like blood against the tongue, though there was none to be seen. Another child remembered hearing the bell ring softly, though the rope swayed untouched. And so the building's story hardened into legend, a place where innocence was expected but dread was bred. Parents still sent their children because there was nowhere else, but each mother lingered longer at the door, and each father told their child not to stay behind after lessons. The schoolhouse became more than a place of learning. It was a vessel, a chamber where something unseen tested the resolve of those who entered. The land itself seemed complicit. Cornfields stretched around the structure like walls, isolating it even from the sky. In the winter, snow piled against its door like a barricade, and in the summer the heat swelled until the very air trembled. Nothing grew in the shadow of its walls. Grass yellowed, flowers bent their stems, and even the crows refused to perch on its roof. The building was alive in its own way, feeding on silence, breathing through its cracks. No official ever marked the vanishings in a ledger, yet every family knew the count. 6 teachers in 20 years, all gone mid-term. Not one accounted for, not one returned. No graves, no bones, no proof. Only the stillness of the empty desk, the impression left in the cushion, the faint smell of chalk and candle smoke lingering after. And always the way the children sat in their rows afterward, quiet, their eyes forward, as though nothing had happened at all. This silence was its own kind of pact. The town carried on, harvest after harvest, as though time would smother the truth. But it never did. Each season layered another weight upon the schoolhouse, until it became less a place of learning than a shrine to what could not be explained. And through it all, the building endured, its paint peeling in strips like shedding skin, its windows darkening with dust. No one ever dared tear it down. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of some unspoken reverence. For those who lived in the town, it was easier to believe the teachers simply chose to leave, to erase themselves from this quiet place. But behind their words lived another truth, an understanding that the building itself demanded them, that every disappearance was not chance, but tribute. And so the schoolhouse stood, silent, watching, its shadow lengthening across the fields as the century turned. Inside its walls, the wood remembered every name, every face, every scream that was never heard beyond the locked door. The people of the town had grown used to the silence, but they knew it was never empty. Something was listening. Something was waiting. And it was patient. Sarah Caro arrived in the town at the first turn of autumn, her boots fresh with dust from the long road, her face bright with the kind of determination only youth can carry. She was 19, raised in a distant county, and her eagerness to teach seemed to radiate from her every movement. The schoolhouse welcomed her with quiet formality, the children curious, the parents guarded. Yet her warmth cut through the unease that always clung to the place. In those first weeks, her laughter filled the air and her handwriting lined the blackboard in careful rows. To the children, she was a gift. Someone who brought gentleness into the wooden room that had felt cold for so long. For a brief time, it seemed as if her presence would banish the shadows that had gathered in silence. But the schoolhouse did not yield so easily. The first sign came on an evening when Sarah lingered after lessons, straightening desks and preparing slates for the morning. As she turned to erase the blackboard, she froze. Across its surface, faint lines scratched downward, jagged and uneven as if made by nails dragged across stone. No one else was inside. The windows were closed, the door latched. She stood staring at the marks until the last of the light faded, then wiped them away with a trembling hand. The sound returned in the nights that followed. At first it was soft, a subtle scrape that could be mistaken for branches in the wind, but it grew clearer, sharper, until Sarah recognized the pattern. It came not from the walls or the floor, but from the board itself. When she lit a candle to check, the black surface showed nothing, smooth as ever. Yet when she stepped back into the dark, the sound resumed like a hand clawing words into silence. Her warmth did not falter in front of the children. She smiled through her lessons, guided their hands, and praised their efforts. But each day her eyes drifted more often toward the board, watching it even as she spoke. At night she carried the unease home with her. She began to dream of letters moving on their own, spelling names she did not know, fading before she could read them. The dreams left her breathless, waking with the taste of chalk on her tongue. By the first snow, Sarah's spirit was thinning. She still carried herself with dignity, but her steps slowed as if weighted by something unseen. Neighbors noticed her candle burned later each night, long after the streets were empty. The children whispered that she spoke more softly now, as though trying not to be overheard. In her small rented room, she kept her lesson books beside her bed, but sometimes she found the pages turned to strange symbols she swore she had never written. The scratching on the board grew louder with each storm. At times it seemed to echo the rhythm of her heart, beating faster as if mocking her fear. She told herself it was the wood shifting in the cold, the nails tightening, the air bending sound. But deep within she felt another truth. Something was listening, waiting for her to falter. And as the winter darkened, Sarah Caro, so bright when she arrived, was already beginning to dim. The school board's ledger was a plain, leather-bound book kept in the desk drawer, meant only for the dull work of recording attendance, salaries, and supplies. Its surface looked ordinary, the kind of object no one would glance at twice. Yet it held the weight of every name that had ever passed through the schoolhouse. One evening, while Sarah prepared her lessons, she found it lying open as if it had been waiting for her. She had not left it that way. Dust outlined its cover, yet the pages inside were disturbingly clean, their paper pale as bone. Her eyes moved down the list of teachers who came before her, each name carefully written in steady script. But the longer she looked, the more she realized something was wrong. Each vanished teacher's name had been crossed out, not with ink, but with marks that looked torn into the page itself. The strokes were uneven, gouged into the fibers so deeply they cut through to the next sheet. The lines resembled wounds more than handwriting, as though someone had pressed a blade against the ledger and dragged until the name bled into silence. The effect was violent, jarring against the neat script surrounding it. What unsettled her most was how the scars of the pen did not fade with age. Even entries from decades earlier looked freshly carved, as if no time had passed between their vanishing and the moment she touched the page. As Sarah turned further, she found other marks that made even less sense. In the margins, symbols had been drawn, but not in ink. They looked burned into the paper, as if someone had pressed heated metal against it. Circles cut through by sharp angles, patterns that seemed half-written letters, half mathematical shapes. They appeared before the earliest recorded names, suggesting they had been placed there before the ledger ever belonged to the board. When she tried to trace them with her finger, the paper felt rough, charred at the edges, as though it carried the memory of fire. The unease pressed into her chest as she realized the order of the names. Each new teacher's entry stood beneath the last, lined in sequence, and each name crossed out continued the pattern of disappearance. The ledger itself had become a record of vanishings, an unbroken chain of silence. The thought passed through her that she was already written inside it, her own name standing at the bottom, still clean, still alive, waiting only for its turn to be scarred. It was not simply a record, it was a promise. That night she carried the ledger to her quarters, though she could not say why. She set it beside her bed, but woke in the dark to find it lying open again. Its pages turned as if unseen hands had leafed through it while she slept. The symbols appeared clearer under candlelight, glowing faintly, forming shapes her mind strained to understand but recoiled from finishing. She felt as though she was being instructed in a language meant only for those who would not live to repeat it. The next day at the schoolhouse, her hand shook when she signed her initials at the bottom of her lessons. She could not stop imagining the motion of the ledger, the slow, deliberate strike that would one day cross her name. The ledger was no longer just a book in her eyes. It was a ritual object, a tool of remembrance and erasure, its pages hungrier than any grave. And the deeper truth began to claw at her thoughts, that the act of crossing out a name was not the end, but the beginning of whatever the building demanded. Ezra Bell moved through the town like a shadow softened by kindness. He was the school's janitor, hired for small wages to tend to the stoves, sweep the floors, and keep the grounds in order. He walked with a slight stoop, his hat always in hand when greeting others, his voice so low that people leaned in to hear him. Neighbors described him as simple, harmless, the sort of man who would never raise his eyes too long nor speak ill of anyone. On Sundays he sat in the same pew, lips moving with every hymn, head bowed as if the weight of devotion pressed down on him more heavily than on others. Children liked him because he carried sweets in his pockets, wrapped in paper, handing them out with a smile that seemed genuine, though his teeth never showed. To all appearances, Ezra was the quiet fixture of the school, a servant of routine, forgettable and safe. But silence is a mask, and beneath his softness lay a discipline darker than most could imagine. Ezra's eyes lingered on every child who passed him, not with affection but with careful study. He noticed the boy who flinched when called upon, the girl who chewed her nails to the quick, the child whose clothes smelled faintly of drink from home. He catalogued these weaknesses with the precision of a clerk, storing them in a ledger of his own, not written on paper but carved into memory. He knew which children feared the dark, which prayed too loudly, which looked away when scolded. He recorded every tremble and every silence, not because he pitied them, but because he believed secrets could be harvested like crops. At night, after the children left, Ezra lingered in the schoolroom longer than necessary. While Sarah Caro erased the board and closed the shutters, he moved quietly through the desks, his fingers brushing the wood where children hid folded notes. He collected them with care, as if gathering fallen leaves, tucking them into his coat. Journals left in satchels, scraps of writing left behind, even the faint doodles carved into desks. He claimed them all. He read them by lamplight in his small bare room, lips moving slowly as though he were repeating scripture. He treated their confessions as a priest might treat a sermon, but with none of the mercy. Each private thought became another string he wound around his mind, another chain with which to bind those who wrote them. In the town's eyes, Ezra was quiet and loyal, but within himself he was more than that. He was an archivist of human weakness, convinced that hidden truths revealed a soul's corruption. He believed it was his task to gather these truths, to weigh them, and to prepare those who guided children for judgment. He considered himself neither cruel nor kind, but necessary, the unseen balance to the innocence that others flaunted so easily. His innocence was only a reflection, a mask polished by obedience, while beneath it his thoughts moved in strict, methodical order, like gears turning in a locked machine. Those who looked at him saw only the harmless smile, the bowed head, the man who swept floors without complaint. But in Ezra's silence lived a hunger not for food or companionship, but for control. The quiet thrill of knowing the words no one else was meant to see, the private tremors of children and teachers alike. He carried these secrets the way others carried prayer books, believing that each page he stole was a step in a larger ritual, one that would one day reveal its purpose fully. For Ezra Bell was not a man forgotten by the schoolhouse. He was the one it had been waiting for. It began without warning, as it always had. One moment a teacher stood before the children, chalk in hand, the cadence of their voice carrying through the room. The next, the words faltered mid-sentence. Their hand trembled and silence fell. The chair behind the desk was still warm, the book still open to its lesson, yet the figure who had guided them was gone. The children stared without moving, as if they had rehearsed this moment in their minds, waiting for it to happen again. They did not cry out. They did not run. They only sat in orderly rows, their eyes fixed forward, as though silence itself had taken command of them. When the last footsteps faded, Ezra Bell would appear. His frame moved softly, almost reverently, broom in hand, cloth tucked into his belt. He would hum under his breath the same hymn he sang on Sundays, a tune of devotion that sounded gentle to any who overheard. He cleaned the desks where fingers had pressed, smoothed the pages left open, erased the chalkboard with a steady hand. He did not ask where the teacher had gone, nor did he pretend to search. His work was precise, unhurried, as if this was the order of things. To him their vanishing was not a tragedy, it was a ceremony. Ezra's method had been perfected over years. The chalk dust carried more than powder. It carried a subtle poison, crushed herbs mixed into it in secret, gathered from roots he boiled in silence behind locked doors. The dust spread in the air when lessons began, invisible as breath. At first it only made the teachers weary, voices softer, eyes heavy. But as the weeks passed, it worked deeper, sliding into their thoughts, making them lose track of time. A trance grew around them like fog. They taught as if dreaming, their words looping back on themselves, their pupils noticing but never daring to speak. The dust wrapped around the teacher's lungs, humming like a lullaby until the body surrendered. When the time came, Ezra guided them away. No one ever saw how. Perhaps through the cellar door, perhaps into a hidden passage, perhaps simply swallowed by the silence that hung in the room. What mattered was that their absence left no trace, no struggle, no sound, only the faint sweetness of the chalk, the lingering warmth of a seat, and the echo of words cut short. Ezra carried them as if performing a sacred duty, convinced each teacher was an offering, a necessary sacrifice to keep the order of the school intact. To the town it appeared sudden and inexplicable. To Ezra it was the careful fruit of his work, the fulfillment of a ritual he alone understood. He believed silence itself demanded payment, and he alone had been chosen to deliver it. His hymn was not praise but concealment, a melody to hide the violence of absence. Every desk he cleaned was a grave unmarked, every erased word on the board another life smothered. He left no stains, no blood, no body, only silence, perfected, polished, eternal. Sarah Caro had begun to live in two worlds. By day she smiled for the children, her voice calm, her handwriting neat, her lessons steady. But beneath the surface a shadow pressed against her nerves, whispering that something in the schoolhouse was terribly wrong. She noticed small details others overlooked, the way Ezra Bell lingered too long in the doorway, the way chalk dust always seemed thicker in the air than it should be, the way the silence after class felt less like rest and more like breath being held. Each day the unease grew sharper until she could no longer ignore the building's strangeness. Her suspicions deepened the evening she reached for the school bell rope. It had not been rung in months, the town avoiding its sound as if it carried an ill omen. Out of curiosity, Sarah climbed the narrow steps to the belfry. The space was tight, filled with dust and the smell of old wood. When she peered into the brass bell, her breath caught. The clapper inside had been filed to a jagged edge, sharpened into a blade. It gleamed faintly even in the dim light, as though oiled to remain ready. The design was not careless. It was deliberate, cruel, waiting for the hand bold enough to summon help. Sarah pulled back quickly, the thought forming that whoever tried to ring it in desperation would not call for aid, but bleed for daring to disturb the silence. That night, unable to rest, Sarah carried her lantern down into the cellar beneath the school. Few entered it, for the air there was damp, the walls crawling with mildew. But as she stepped inside, she realized it had been used far more than anyone admitted. Desks were stored there, not broken or discarded, but altered. Their wooden frames had been carved with grooves that fit wrists and ankles, restraints disguised as furniture. The surfaces bore faint stains, iron-colored and old, sunk deep into the grain. She touched one mark with her fingertips and drew them back quickly, her skin prickling as if the wood itself recoiled from her. It was not the dirt of time, but the memory of something spilled in struggle. The lantern flickered, and shadows of the desk stretched across the stone walls like children bound in rows, their silence screaming louder than voices ever could. Sarah's chest tightened as she realized these were not mistakes or accidents. They were arrangements, tools crafted for a ritual beyond the reach of ordinary thought. Each desk carried the imprint of suffering, each stain a fragment of the truth that had been erased upstairs. Her dread grew into certainty. The vanishings were not mysteries of fate or chance. They were the result of design, of intent, of someone who believed silence must be enforced through sacrifice. And the schoolhouse itself, with its sharpened bell and its hidden cellar, was not simply a place of learning. It was a stage, prepared carefully, awaiting its next lesson in cruelty. Sarah knew then that her presence here was not a chance, but an appointment, and her turn was coming. Ezra Bell did not think of his acts as cruelty. To him they were lessons, the kind the world refused to teach. He believed teachers carried lies in their voices, filling children with weakness, dulling the edge of truth. So he devised his own curriculum, one that could only be written in silence, one that required flesh and bone as the blackboard. In the cellar where the desks had been carved into restraints, he remade the schoolroom into a theater of ritual. Each captive teacher was no longer an instructor, but a pupil, bound and trembling before the order he demanded. He began with language, the foundation of all learning. For Ezra, words were unholy unless proven. He nailed tongues into spelling boards, pinning them down letter by letter, forcing his captives to choke on the very symbols they once gave to children. When they could no longer speak, he claimed the silence as victory, the lesson complete. Arithmetic came next. He believed numbers must be written on the body itself, carved with care, the blade replacing chalk. He drew multiplication tables into their skin, aligning equations across ribs and thighs until their flesh resembled school slates filled with problems no child could solve. Geometry was his favorite. He saw beauty in the body's structure and the angles of joints in the symmetry of bones. He broke arms and set them at impossible angles, rearranging the frame until it matched the diagrams he carried in his head. Circles traced in blood, triangles made from shattered bone, arcs drawn with ropes pulled tight, each figure a demonstration that learning was never abstract, but carved into reality. When the body collapsed under the weight of these lessons, Ezra recorded it not as death but as graduation, proof that the false had been stripped away. He kept his rituals meticulous. The hymn he hummed above the children's desks echoed here in the cellar, soft and steady, masking the sounds of suffering. The air smelled of chalk and iron, the mixture of classroom and crypt. To him there was no difference between the two. Each act was sacred, each torment necessary. He believed he was giving order to chaos, teaching truths that no book dared to hold. What others would see as horror, Ezra saw as discipline. He called it correction, the purging of weakness through education. And when his captives no longer breathed, he arranged their remains with the patience of a craftsman. Bones became diagrams, hair braided into rulers, nails hammered into desks as reminders of lessons completed. He was not careless. He was methodical, recording his work in silence, ensuring every act mirrored the rituals of a classroom. The town above went on in ignorance, hearing only the hum of his broom, seeing only the innocent smile of a man too quiet to question. But beneath their feet the true school continued, each lesson more terrible than the last, each ritual binding Ezra tighter to the darkness he called truth. Hidden in the false bottom of a desk drawer beneath layers of chalk dust and brittle lesson plans lay Ezra Bell's private journal. It was not leather-bound or ornate but plain, its cover worn smooth as though handled far too often. Inside, the handwriting was startlingly neat, each line formed with the precision of a schoolboy still desperate to please a teacher. Letters were rounded, margins exact, no ink blotted or smeared. It was the kind of handwriting one might expect from a child who feared correction. Yet the words carried a weight that no child should ever imagine. Ezra began his entries with hymns, short phrases repeated like prayers, written in looping repetition across pages. But beneath these surface devotions, his thoughts spilled into chilling clarity. He wrote of the teachers as false shepherds, voices that led children astray with weakness disguised as wisdom. He believed their lessons softened the will, made children pliant and fragile. To Ezra, this was sin, the greatest corruption a community could suffer. And so he took upon himself the role of purifier, reshaping the role of janitor into judge. The journal described his rituals without shame, almost with pride. He recorded each disappearance as though marking attendance, dates noted, names listed. He referred to them as examinations, claiming he was not killing but testing. If they failed to survive silence, they had proven themselves unworthy to instruct. He wrote of tongues pinned to boards as demonstrations of honesty, of skin carved with arithmetic as a way of inscribing truth, of bones arranged in geometric designs to reflect divine order. Each act was recorded not as brutality but as a lesson completed, a grade sealed in silence. The more one read, the clearer his logic became, twisted yet methodical. He believed the schoolhouse itself demanded obedience, that it was not merely a building but a vessel for order older than the town itself. He wrote that the walls drink the sound of lies, that the floors collect the dust of failure, and that he was chosen to maintain this purity. Every stroke of his broom, every hymn hummed under his breath, was part of a sacred duty to keep corruption from taking root. What made the writing unbearable was not only the acts he confessed, but the tone in which he described them. The words were calm, innocent, almost tender. He wrote as though guiding a child through arithmetic problems, his language soft and patient, never angry, never rushed. His cruelty was hidden beneath a veil of normalcy, presented in the voice of a dutiful student who had never left the schoolroom. In one entry, he even practiced penmanship exercises, writing the alphabet again and again between passages, detailing how he had drained a voice into silence. The journal revealed a man who had not grown into madness but had remained trapped in it. A child's hand writing a psychopath's scripture. Ezra Bell had learned to mask himself with humility and routine, yet on those pages he allowed the mask to slip, showing the method that had become his entire life. To read it was to step into the mind of someone who believed evil was not chaos but discipline, not rage but order. And it was in that order, perfected through ritual, that Ezra found his meaning. Sarah Caro had lived with fear for weeks, the dread building each night as the scratching on the board grew louder, and the secrets of the cellar weighed heavier in her mind. The discovery of Ezra's hidden chamber, desks turned into restraints, stains soaked deep into the wood, the smell of iron that clung to the walls, had shattered whatever illusions of safety she had left. She knew she had stumbled into the truth of the disappearances, and she knew she was not meant to survive it. At first, she planned to leave quietly, to gather her few belongings and slip away into the fields. But the schoolhouse was never so kind. Each time she neared the thought of escape, something pulled her back, the way the children looked at her, the way their silence seemed to plead for her not to abandon them, the way Ezra's eyes lingered on her as if he already knew her intentions. The morning she vanished began like any other. The children filed in, boots wet from melted snow, their breaths puffing in the cold air. Sarah stood before them, chalk in hand, her voice steady though her heart trembled. She told herself this would be the last day, that tonight she would flee no matter the cost. Yet even as she wrote on the board, the dust rising faintly in the air, she felt her body faltering. The room seemed heavier, as if the very walls leaned inward. The children shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing something unspoken. Ezra moved quietly at the back, broom in hand, humming under his breath, his tune drowning out the sound of her own pulse. Her hand shook as she wrote the lesson, the chalk breaking mid-stroke, splintering across the board. She tried to steady herself, but her vision blurred, the letters twisting into shapes she could not recognize. A wave of dizziness swept through her, the air thick with the faint sweetness of the chalk dust Ezra had prepared. She dropped the chalk, and it clattered to the floor louder than it should have. The children froze. In that silence, Sarah turned toward them, her lips trembling, her face pale. She whispered only one word, a word that tore through her throat like a final plea. Run. But the children did not move. They sat fixed in their rows, their wide eyes staring as though bound by an unseen command. And in the next instant, Sarah was gone. There was no scream, no struggle, no frantic sound of flight. One moment she stood before them, trembling yet alive, and the next the space was empty, her chair still warm, her lesson book still open, her presence erased as though swallowed by the room itself. The children later recalled the moment with the same chilling calm, repeating again and again that she had simply disappeared, her last word echoing long after she was gone. None of them ever spoke of seeing Ezra move, yet each remembered the sound of his hymn filling the silence that followed, soft and steady as he bent to collect the broken chalk from the floor. Sarah Caro never left the schoolhouse, and her name, like those before her, was soon crossed from the ledger with a stroke sharp enough to cut through paper and into eternity. Decades passed before anyone dared to pry open the schoolhouse floor. By then the building had sagged into its own shadow, its windows clouded with dust, its roof bowed under years of storms. The townspeople spoke of it in fragments, a place avoided rather than explained. But when progress demanded its demolition, workers began stripping the floorboards. Their tools struck hollow, and beneath the planks they uncovered a crawl space long sealed from sight. The air that rose from it was heavy, sweet with rot, and colder than the winter outside. Lanterns were lowered, and what the light revealed stopped every hand in silence. The crawl space was not a void, but a chamber of order, as if arranged by a meticulous archivist. Bones filled the space, not scattered, but set in neat rows like obedient pupils still waiting for instruction. Skulls faced forward, jawbones aligned, as though even in death they were forced to sit in class. Between them lay artifacts crafted with intention. Wooden rulers had been honed into spikes, their edges sharp and polished, each one planted upright like a warning. Writing slates were stacked against the wall, etched not with chalk, but with deep grooves carved by human fingernails, words half-formed in desperation. Some bore repeated phrases, no more voice and lesson, finished, scratched until the slate itself cracked. Among the remains, investigators found objects that belonged to the vanished teachers. A pair of spectacles crushed flat, a rosary stained dark, a locket snapped shut with hair still inside. And there, folded with unnatural care, lay a dress of pale fabric. It was untouched by dust, its cloth impossibly preserved, as though time itself had chosen to protect it. The dress belonged to Sarah Caro. Every other relic carried the scars of decay, but hers rested in stillness, positioned as if prepared for her return. The children who had once whispered of her disappearance were now grown or gone. Yet the presence of that dress, unmarked by age, seemed to confirm that Sarah had never truly left the schoolhouse. She had been kept here in this tomb arranged not for burial but for display. The walls of the crawl space bore carvings that only deepened the dread. Numbers and shapes had been cut into the beams, arithmetic tables burned into the wood, geometric patterns sketched with ash and blood. Each figure mirrored the twisted lessons Ezra Bell had once carried out above. It was not random scrawl, but a curriculum preserved in bone and splinter. The chamber was both grave and classroom, a place where suffering had been recorded not in ink, but in flesh. As the investigators stood in that narrow space, their lanterns flickering against the aligned skulls and sharpened tools, the silence pressed in like a weight. It was the silence of decades of lessons carried out in secrecy, of ritual polished into habit. The crawlspace was not simply hidden. It was built as a sanctuary of order. The final proof that Ezra Bell's work had not been madness in his mind, but devotion. Sarah's folded dress lay at its center like a final assignment, untouched, unfinished, waiting for a teacher who would never rise again. Ezra Bell grew old without suspicion ever falling on him. His life was measured in the rhythm of the broom across the schoolhouse floor, the steady hum of hymns under his breath, the bowed head in the same pew each Sunday. When the school finally closed, when whispers and fear outlived the need for its lessons, Ezra remained in town as a harmless fixture. He swept other floors, carried buckets for neighbors, nodded politely at strangers. His smile never changed, soft and unthreatening, the smile of a man others forgot as soon as they passed him. Yet in his silence, his rituals lived on, locked within him like a hidden scripture. Age bent his back and dimmed his eyes, but his thoughts never softened. In the stillness of his final years, he spoke more often to himself than to others. Those who heard him muttering in the churchyard or along the road assumed it was the confusion of a fading mind. They did not hear the order in his words, the sermon-like cadence that carried through his lips as he recounted the lessons of a lifetime. He spoke of false shepherds silenced, of voices corrected, of perfect lessons completed. His tone was not regretful but satisfied, as if he had lived exactly as intended, each disappearance a chapter in the holy book only he believed in. When illness finally pinned him to his bed, he did not struggle. He lay with hands folded, whispering fragments of hymns and equations, reciting both scripture and arithmetic in the same breath. The townspeople who tended him found it unsettling, the way his neat voice slipped from numbers to prayers to the names of teachers long vanished. To them, it was the fever of an old man losing himself. But to Ezra, it was the closing of his curriculum, the summing of his life's work into one final performance, an invisible congregation listening as he marked the end of his lessons. He died quietly, his last words a fragment of ritual. Order kept. Silence is pure. His passing was met with polite sorrow. The church buried him in the yard beside men and women whose lives had been ordinary. His grave no different, no stone more remarkable. The ground above him gave no sign of the weight he carried in secret, no hint of the horror woven into his service. The town moved on, relieved perhaps that his life had ended without incident, without scandal, without explanation. But the schoolhouse remained, abandoned, its windows broken, its walls leaning with time. It stood untouched, the way no one had dared to demolish it. The building seemed to endure as Ezra had endured, ordinary on the surface, yet holding something darker in silence. Children no longer entered its doors, yet the desks below still bore their restraints. The bones still sat in their rows. Sarah Caro's dress still lay folded as if waiting. Ezra's body rested in consecrated earth, But his true legacy remained above ground, sealed in wood and stone, a classroom that remembered him far better than the churchyard ever would. The children of the schoolhouse grew into adults, scattered by time into farms, trades, and families of their own. For years they held their silence, burying their memories under the same soil that covered Ezra Bell. But silence has weight, and as age bent their backs and loosened their tongues, fragments of truth slipped out in memoirs and journals, in confessions whispered to children and grandchildren who barely believed them. What emerged was not a single story but a pattern, each account confirming what another had feared but never dared to speak aloud. They remembered Ezra's eyes, not the soft, downcast gaze he showed the town, but the way he watched through the knotholes of the wooden walls. They recalled feeling his stare on the backs of their necks as they recited lessons, the prickling of skin that told them they were being studied. Some wrote that they could hear him breathing on the other side, a slow, steady rhythm that never faltered. Others remembered the sound of the broom bristles dragging along the floor when no one else was present, as though he swept in patterns only he understood. They remembered the smell. Beneath the sharp bite of chalk and coal smoke there lingered another odor, faint but constant. The smell of ash and iron that seeped up from the floorboards. They never named it then, for children lacked the words, but in old age they described it clearly. The odor of blood burned into wood, the stench of something hidden and smoldering beneath their feet. They recalled how the smell was strongest on mornings after a teacher vanished, when the air itself seemed thicker, and yet no adult ever asked why. They remembered the silence. It was not only the silence that followed a disappearance, but the silence they themselves enforced. They knew instinctively never to speak of the empty chair, never to question the unfinished lesson. It became an unspoken rule, a pact etched deeper than any chalk mark. They sat in their rows, eyes forward, lips closed as though an unseen hand guided their obedience. Even decades later in their memoirs, some admitted they did not know if this silence was chosen or forced, if it was fear or something more, something Ezra had planted in them, a discipline that lasted a lifetime. Most haunting were the memories of Sarah Caro. The older pupils recalled the way her voice cracked in the days before she vanished, the tremor in her hands as she wrote on the board. They remembered the moment she dropped the chalk, the way her lips formed the word run, and how not one of them moved. Even as adults, they could not explain why. They only remembered Ezra's humming afterward, soft and steady as he gathered the chalk from the floor while they sat paralyzed in their seats. These confessions, scattered across decades, painted a portrait of a classroom not of learning but of control. A place where children were shaped as much by silence as by instruction. They carried the weight of those years until death, haunted by the knowledge that they had been witnesses, not bystanders. They had been molded, trained, and kept silent by a man whose evil wore the mask of innocence, and by a building that seemed to obey him as much as they did. By the middle of the 20th century, the schoolhouse no longer served a purpose. The town had grown. Modern buildings had replaced wooden rooms, and children now walked to brick structures filled with electric lights and polished floors. The old one-room building sagged in the fields like a scar too familiar to forget. Its roof leaked, its paint peeled away in strips and weeds pressed against its foundation. Yet even as it decayed, no one touched it for decades. It was easier to let it rot quietly than to face what had long been whispered inside its walls. But time was not merciful, and eventually progress demanded the land, so men with machines came to tear it down. The first blow of the demolition hammer rattled more than wood. When the walls were pried open, the workers discovered that the beams themselves had been altered. Packed into the hollow frames of the schoolhouse were fragments of human remains. Jagged pieces of jawbones, their teeth still intact, wedged deliberately into the timber as though placed there by careful hands. They were not the result of an accident or collapse. Each fragment had been positioned like a charm, embedded in the structure as if the building itself had been stitched together with bone. The realization spread through the crew slowly, with the dawning horror that the schoolhouse had been both classroom and reliquary, its very walls sealed with talismans of silence. Forensic teams were called, but the findings were never broadcast loudly. The records were kept thin, written in vague language, the details withheld from public hearing. Still, those who worked the demolition remembered the site. They recalled the way the jawbones seemed arranged in patterns facing inward, as though to watch anyone who dared to teach inside. Some believed the placement was symbolic, the mouths closed and locked forever in wood, a warning against speaking too freely. Others thought it was Ezra Bell's final lesson. A school literally built upon silence, its frame carrying the voices he had stolen. When the debris was cleared, more objects were unearthed. Broken rulers filed into spikes, scraps of fabric folded as if preserved, bits of slate etched with names scratched too faintly to read. The investigators pieced together what they could, but each discovery raised more questions than it answered. How many had vanished within those walls? How long had the ritual gone on? Why had no one spoken of it until now? The silence of the town persisted, just as it had when the teachers first disappeared. People nodded gravely, called it tragedies of the past, and moved on. Yet even in silence, the unease found shape. Laws began to change quietly in the years that followed. School boards across the region altered their vetting processes, requiring records, references, and oversight that had not been demanded before. Committees were formed to review not only the hiring of teachers but the staff who worked beside them, ensuring that no janitor or caretaker slipped through unnoticed. Parents were given more presence at meetings, encouraged to watch, to question, to ensure transparency in what was once left behind closed doors. None of these changes were publicly tied to Ezra Bell or his schoolhouse, yet those who remembered knew exactly why they had come. The site where the school once stood was leveled, grass planted over the scar. No memorial was built, no plaque erected. The town chose erasure rather than remembrance, a legacy that continued the very silence Ezra had cultivated. Children played on the new fields, their laughter ringing where once hymns had hummed under the breath of a predator. But beneath the soil lay the memory of jawbones cemented into wood, a reminder that evil does not always shout. It whispers, it hides, it survives in silence until forced into the open. For the older residents, the demolition brought no comfort. Some admitted in their journals that they felt relief when the walls came down, as if a pressure had lifted from the air. Others confessed to unease, certain that tearing down the schoolhouse had only freed something buried, losing it upon the land without containment. They wrote of dreams where children still sat in rows beneath the earth, skulls aligned, eyes forward, waiting for a lesson that would never end. The folded dress of Sarah Caro appeared in those dreams again and again, untouched by dust, resting in the dark like an unfinished chapter. The legacy of silence became part of the town's identity, though no one spoke it aloud. Generations later, parents still lingered longer at schoolhouse doors, still asked questions about the safety of classrooms, still warned their children never to stay too long after lessons. They did not reference Ezra Bell by name, but the shadow of his order remained. The laws, the oversight, the watchfulness, all were born from a single building that had once stood proud against the Indiana fields, hiding its rituals within plain walls. The demolition ended the structure, but it did not end the truth it represented. The bones inside the beams ensured that Ezra's work would outlive him, a hidden testimony that evil can disguise itself as order, that cruelty can hide behind routine, that silence itself can be the most enduring prison. And though the building was gone, the legacy it left was not one of memory but of unease, echoing still in every classroom where parents fear the things their children are taught, and the things left unspoken. Evil does not always arrive with fire or fury. More often it wears the face of order, the quiet mask of routine, the innocence of a bowed head and a polite smile. Ezra Bell was never the stranger in the night or the vagrant at the edge of town. He was the man trusted to sweep the floors, to light the stoves, to bow in prayer beside the very families whose children sat in his reach. His crimes were not born of frenzy but of patience. He built them like lessons, repeated and refined until cruelty became as ordinary as chalk on a board. This is why no one suspected. This is why silence endured. The schoolhouse became his cathedral, not through violence in the open but through rituals hidden in plain sight. His hymns hummed softly while teachers vanished. His brooms swept quietly while bones were stacked beneath the floor. His ledgers recorded names as though keeping attendance rather than sealing fates. There was no madness in his eyes, no chaos in his actions. He believed in what he did. He believed it was necessary. And that is what makes him most terrifying. For the greatest horrors are not always acts of rage, but acts of conviction, carried out by hands steady with purpose. Ezra hid behind innocence, but innocence was not his disguise. It was his weapon. He used his quiet manner as a shield, his politeness as a wall, his devotion to church as proof of character. Each trait became a tool sharper than the blades he hid within the school bell. He understood that communities fear the strange, but they rarely fear the familiar. So he became familiar, woven into the fabric of the town until he was no longer questioned. This trust gave him space to act. This trust gave him silence. And in silence he thrived. What does this say about evil itself? That it does not always appear as an intruder breaking down doors, but as a neighbor holding them open. That it can live for years unnoticed, not because it is invisible, but because it chooses to act where suspicion is weakest. Inside homes, inside schools, schools inside the institutions meant to protect. Ezra Bell was not a ghost, though the town remembered him as one. He was flesh and blood, and his power came not from darkness alone, but from the willingness of others to look away. The demolition of the schoolhouse revealed his trophies, but it did not erase the truth. The beams held bones because he placed them there. The desks bore restraints because he carved them. The silence that haunted generations was not born of superstition, but of his careful hand. And though time has passed, his story lingers because it forces us to ask a question we never want to face. How many others like him have hidden in plain sight, their rituals mistaken for routine, their evil carried out behind ordinary doors? Evil thrives in repetition. It thrives in the calm rhythm of daily tasks, in the ordinary faces we stop questioning. Ezra understood this. He knew that to strike once in rage would expose him, but to strike again and again in silence would build a legacy too deeply rooted to be undone. He did not need chaos. He needed only patience and the trust of a community too frightened to name what they already feared. And so the story ends, not with his capture nor with justice, but with reflection. Ezra Bell was buried in consecrated ground, his grave no different than any other, while the victims he silenced became fragments hidden in beams and crawl spaces. The town carried on, its laws quietly shifting, its parents quietly watching, its silence quietly preserved. The building was torn down, but its shadow remained, cast not on the fields of Indiana alone, but on every place where routine conceals cruelty. What do we learn from this? That evil does not need to shout. It whispers, it hums hymns beneath its breath. It smiles with downcast eyes. It sweeps floors and bows in prayer. And in that calm it waits for us to look away, to accept silence as safety, to mistake routine for goodness. Ezra Bell is gone, but the truth he represents is not. Evil can hide in any school, any home, any institution that welcomes trust without question. And so the final question falls not upon the past, but upon the present. What do you think? Could this happen again?